Welcome everyone. We have a very special guest today. I'm so excited. You can see the thrilling in my eyes if you're listening to this. I hope you can hear my smiles. I'm so excited. Dr. Dan McClellan, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
We have about 30 questions for you. This is
Oh,
going to
well.
be on debunking biblical history. We're going to specifically stay with the historical aspect of
Hmm.
the Bible and things like that. This used to be my wheelhouse, and I gave it over happily to other people to deal with, people who are better at the scholarship than I am.
So you're the elderly Gina Davis on the baseball field listening to this used to be my... I don't know how much I can sing of that song before Madonna comes after us, but um,
That's okay. Maybe then we'll get monetized. So please do. Yeah, I mean, even my old wheelhouse, I still only know things in the ancient Hebrew. So if
mhm.
you're saying something like, I know, for example, that you were talking about a person named Habakkuk on your pod, and I just sat there for 5 minutes and went, "Oh my God, is this a person I don't? What is this?" And then I realized,
Yeah,
"Oh my God, it's Habakkuk. Oh God."
yeah.
It takes the pronunciation, Canaanite linguistic change aside. It took me a while. So if I have to repeat something where I think to myself, I do not know what this is in the English, please just ignore me and listen to Dan.
Yeah.
So okay, let's start off with a very easy question, which
Okay.
is what is the Septuagint really
Hmm.
translated by 70 people? Is it a
No.
no,
Okay. So,
is
oh, sorry.
oh, I apologize. This is a many part question. Is
Okay.
it is it a faithful translation? The translation of the 70, was not really until like the time of Augustine. So what do you think of the Septuagint and its historical value?
I think it has immense historical value in the sense that it allows us to capture a cross section of not only the state of the text of the Hebrew Bible, but also the interpretive traditions that were operative in that time period. But it was not translated all at once. It was not translated by 70 scribes. The letter of Aristeas or pseudo Aristeas is just a legend that was probably written within about a century of when the Torah was probably originally translated into Greek, between around the third century BCE down to the first century BCE. And the books were translated by different folks, and so there's been a lot of work on tracking down the translation technique and all this kind of stuff. Some of them tend to be more literal than others. Some of them tend to be a little more free, but the framework of faithfulness is interesting because that might not necessarily have to do with literal versus free so much as it has to do with how it's interpreted. I think most scholars of the Septuagint would say overwhelmingly it is faithful in the sense that the translators are trying to represent their best interpretation of the texts that are before them. But there are a couple of caveats. One, the texts that are before them probably didn't always match the text that we have available to us today. And we can see this in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are a few different kind of manuscript traditions that are represented among the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have a Proto-Masoretic text that is represented there. We have something that aligns more frequently with the Septuagint than with the Masoretic text. We have something that aligns with the Samaritan Pentateuch many times over and against the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. And then we have others that are either considered a fourth tradition or they don't align with any tradition, where it's just something else altogether. So textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible is very, very messy, but the Septuagint is an important tool that we have to try to reconstruct how people were interpreting the text, and in some cases what the text looked like in the last few centuries BCE. And so I think it is incredibly important. The legend about Philadelphus inviting the 72 scholars from Jerusalem to stay in the Pharos and the lighthouse in Alexandria and come together and for these grand dinners where they wax philosophic about this, that, and the other aspects of the law. That's all legend. None of that happened. That's a way to try to suggest that, look, it was divinely approved. Therefore, stamp of approval. Nobody can change anything in the
It's a great
Septuagint.
story.
It is. It's a phenomenal story. I think it's such a lovely story, but yeah, entirely legendary. But the Septuagint did come together in near the same time period. By the 2nd century CE, that's when we get some of our recensions, Aquila, Symmachus, and so on, that are trying to bring the text around to kind of a standardized form, which would then become the Masoretic texts in the medieval period. But I think the Septuagint is incredibly fascinating and an important historical artifact, to be sure.
Fantastic. Great. Speaking of great stories, are you a believer in Q? And not the Star Trek Next Generation Q, because we all believe in him. We know he's real. But some well-known scholars like the great Dr. Helen Bond are not. But how do you feel about the possible existence of Q? And would you just clarify I know what it is, but maybe people don't know what Q is.
So Q stands for Quelle, which is a German word that means source. And the idea is that this is a hypothesized source text for the features of Matthew and Luke that are shared between each other, but are not found in Mark. So the idea is Matthew and Luke seem to be drawing a lot of their stuff from Mark, but then there are also things that are parallel between the two of them, but that obviously don't come from Mark. Where did that come from?
They're copying each other's homework.
Yeah, something like that. So there are different theories to account for how they are both representing these stories in the same exact way. And so the leading theory for a long, long time was the Q source, which is basically a sayings gospel that contains a number of sayings of Jesus that we find in both Luke and Matthew. And I tend to think that folks like Mark Goodacre and Helen Bond, I'm not a specialist in that field, so I don't have particularly strong feelings, but I'm going to side with them. I trust their scholarship an awful lot. And so I'm going to say I would probably, if I were forced, would say I suspend judgment on this question. I want to see what happens. But if I'm forced to pick one over the other, I'm probably going to be against Q rather than for Q.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Helen Bond, I think her new book, The Historical Jesus, I don't know if it touches too much on this, but her work in general on this and talking about it is really, really fascinating. It's really great.
Yeah.
I don't lay any embargo. You can be undecided. You don't have to take a side.
Great. Handy.
Next question. So, what are the Enochic texts? Are the Book of Giants and Jubilees part of them, and were they written around the same time?
I think you would have an awful lot of people who would count them among the Enochic texts, but usually when people are talking about the Enochic literature, they're talking about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch, which are specific collections of texts, which do not include the Book of Giants and the Book of Jubilees, but they're kind of in the same family. They're doing the same thing, which is basically gathering together fan fiction about primarily Genesis and Exodus. And 1st Enoch is basically taking Genesis 6, that story about the B'nai Elohim, where they are having children with the Benot Adam, the daughters of humanity. And it's kind of just blowing it up into this large-scale narrative about how there's this head malevolent angel who descends to earth and a bunch of other angels comes with them. And, sometimes they're referred to as Mastema. Sometimes it's Melchirashah. That's what you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sometimes it's Shemi Hazah or Asael or Azazel or the Angel of Darkness. There are a bunch of different names for this head malevolent angel. But this is actually, a lot of scholars think, the origin of the concept of a lead bad guy who becomes the devil, who becomes Satan once you get into later Greco-Roman period Jewish literature and then into the New Testament. And so, and this is something interesting, I think, that a lot of people don't think about. There are a lot of differences today between Judaism and Christianity that come from a similar kind of seedbed. But whereas Christianity took up the Greco-Roman stream of tradition within Judaism, what would become Rabbinic Judaism kind of departed from it and said, now we're going back to the Hebrew Bible. And so that's the source of a lot of the differences. But Christianity is very firmly rooted in Greco-Roman period Jewish interpretive traditions, which include first Enoch. Second and third Enoch are even a little bit influential in their own ways. But Jubilees in the Book of Giants are doing the same thing. Jubilees is a little more situated within Exodus, having to do with calendars and things like that. But they're part of that same large-scale Greco-Roman period project of textual production and fan fiction. But I would say not technically a part of the Enochic literature.
Yeah, when I first heard other people talking about Enoch, I thought, oh, what is that? Is that Enoch? Is that what that is? And I mean, we learned it very, very nominally. And I spoke to Tam before, and I said that my background was all in the ancient Hebrew, and so I love this stuff. See, I love this crap. This is my thing, and this is really the books of Enoch are really what got me into. And I don't know if you know, but there's also like a video game called El Shaddai, and a lot of video games use Enochic texture for their just to flavor their games, because there's a lot of talk about angels and demons and things like that. Obviously, even creatures like Lilith are mentioned very briefly. So I saw all of this because when you're reading the text or the original text and you think of something like the Nephilim, you go, where did these guys come from? That's kind of weird. And then you find like the extra stuff of, like you said, the gorgeous fan fiction that creates all of the demons. You go, ooh, this is exciting. But then you think, wait a minute, this is the good stuff. Why was this left out? And obviously you learn later that this is a much later construction. This is not something that was written at the same time. So I think a lot of people who have interest in this stuff, I think they should go and read it, but keep in mind that we're talking, as you said, we're talking about two very different time periods about things. So, the Greco-Roman is the fan fiction era, which I think is arguably the more exciting. But Yep. Just because, again, where my interests lie, but you have to take it to account that these are things that came afterwards. So a lot of juice was added to the sauce at the end. And as long as you're okay with that, you can have a great time, reading these things, but don't read too much into them and think, oh, this is what the original authors of the Bible really meant. We don't know. Yeah. So speaking of which, what are the differences in Abraham's story between the versions of the Bible? Are there differences between different sources, as in the JEDP source theory? So I guess J as in Yahwist, E as in Elohist, and then I think Deuteronomy is the D.
Deuteronomist, is
and
the
then
D
P
source.
is the priestly writings, I think.
Well, we have the Book of Genesis is where you have Abraham, and that is traditionally that has been identified primarily with J, E, and P. However, these days there are a lot of scholars who suggest that J and E are not full documentary sources, that those are actually just kind of isolated fragmentary sources that we've kind of lumped together and labeled them as if they were independent literary units, and they probably were not. So I would say many scholars today just refer to DP and non-P. And so within Abraham, you have a few different, I think there are some layers that you can discern within Abraham. You have things happening more than once. For instance, and Abraham is introduced to God two different times. One time, God is introduced to Abraham as El Shaddai. Another time, God is introduced to Abraham as Adonai or Hashem, according to what I've heard the majority Jewish tradition. And then you go to a text like Exodus 6:3, where you have the second introduction of God to Moses, where God says, I was known to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as El Shaddai, but by my name Adonai, I did not make myself known to them. And it's kind of, wait a minute, let's go back here. There's God saying, I am Adonai, and Abraham going, but Adonai. And so what's going on here? And there are a lot of scholars who think that, one, Genesis and Exodus were originally composed independently of each other and only secondarily stitched together, one coming after the other. But also, the author of Exodus 6:3 seems to have in front of them, either because they don't know of other versions or because they don't like other versions, they seem to have a version of the patriarchal narratives where Adonai is unknown, where the God is some kind of El deity, whether El Shaddai, El Roi, something like that. And I think there's one story in Genesis 20 where you have, I think it's Abraham and Abimelech. Throughout the whole story, it's where Abraham shows up, and then Abimelech's like, "Hey, things are going haywire with the town. What's going on here?" And Abraham says, "Oh, that's not really my sister. That's my wife." And then Abimelech freaks out. And
Oh, Avimelech. Oh my God, I just
oh
got it.
yeah,
Oh God.
sorry, that's I generally use the traditional English
I'm
pronunciation.
so sorry. But as you're talking, I'm thinking, okay, yes, what story? Oh my God,
I
it's
know this name.
Avimelech. Okay, yes. Apologies. Yeah, continue.
And but Abraham and Abimelech both refer to just Elohim, God.
Mhm.
And then there's a part at the end where it says, "Oh, and all of Abimelech's family was healed, and the women could conceive again, and because of Adonai." And so it's like one verse where, and two things are odd here. It's the only verse where it uses the name Adonai, but also it brings up this thing about the women not conceiving, and it's like, wait a minute, the story doesn't say anything about this. Where is this coming from? This is resolving an issue that was never identified in the rest of the story, which suggests that we have somebody who either knows a different version of this story or is just kind of slapping an ending on to a different story. And so it suggests there are literary layers going on there. And another thing that I think is fascinating is that if you look throughout the entire book of Genesis, there's not a single personal name that has a Yahwistic theophoric element in it. Nobody named their child, no author named a character after Adonai, even though that is overwhelmingly the predominant theophoric element that we find in the names from Exodus on to the end of the Hebrew Bible. And so I think that is pretty convincing evidence that there were different versions of these patriarchal narratives in circulation.
As well, I think in one of the narratives, isn't that because there's obviously Abraham and his son, but in one of the narratives, I think he doesn't kill him, or he does kill him.
There are several medieval Jewish traditions that talk about where Isaac's blood was spilled, for instance, or that say he spent 3 days with God before being brought back to life. Because if you look at the story there, it keeps saying, and Abraham and Isaac went on, and they walked on, and they traveled on, and they get to the spot, and then whatever happens, and then it says, and Abraham returned to his young men, and they went back. And it's like, wait a minute, what happened to Isaac?
Did he do it? Yeah.
And so there are a lot of traditions that hold that he did do it, that he did sacrifice his son. And you even find this in as late as like 15th, 16th, 17th century Judaism in Europe, where they're talking about the sacrifice of Isaac. And Isaac also disappears from the narrative for a while and comes back later. And one of the traditions is that Isaac was in heaven with God, and then didn't come back to the narrative until God was like, "All right, you're resurrected, or you're coming back," or something like that. So
he was tired.
Yeah, I just need a little
nap.
rest.
I'll be back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I love that. I think that's interesting. I mean, it was something that you talk about as well a lot in your videos, and even on Data Over Dogma, is you talk a lot about univocality and how it's quite impossible. And in order to really understand the Bible and the narrative, and how many people have actually touched hands on the text, you have to sort of get rid of this idea of univocality, because it's not healthy in an academic sense. And if you can't divorce yourself from that idea that only one person wrote all of this, you're not really going to go anywhere in terms of learning the text.
Right.
Yeah. Here's a very interesting question. What are the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas? Why were they so popular with early Christians, and why have they been forgotten? I confess, I did not know any of this until I was about 25. I just went, wow, what are these stories? This is amazing. So please tell everybody who doesn't know.
So these are early Christian texts that were probably written toward the end of the 1st century CE or the beginning of the 2nd century CE, and they may predate some of the texts that are in the New Testament. Some of the things like 2 Peter and the pastoral epistles are probably written around 120 to 150 CE, so pretty late. But they are basically different visions and proverbs and stories that are talking about early Christians and their relationship with Jesus and how they kind of come to an understanding of what Jesus expects. And they were considered authoritative for a lot of early Christians. In fact, some of our earliest uncial manuscripts. So these are Greek codices with the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament written in all caps with no spaces or vowels or accents or anything like that. Like Sinaiticus, include the Epistle of Barnabas, whereas another, I think, has the Shepherd of Hermas. But they were considered authoritative and inspired for a while. But by the time that the church as an institution begins to kind of wonder about what should we be using, what shouldn't we be using, and the scholars and the authorities are going around asking the different congregations, what texts are you using in your services, what are you considering appropriate to quote from and to cite as authoritative, they begin to get a little wobbly, and they fall out of favor by the time we have the kind of delineation of what we're going to accept as inspired scripture, as canonical. And that's something that happens primarily in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. But they were considered quite important for multiple centuries within Christianity. But yeah, they're texts that could have made it into the New Testament, if not for some accidents of history. And I think fascinating text to read just to get a sense for how much different Christianity during the period when the New Testament was being written really was, because there's a lot of stuff that overlaps with what we see in the Gospels in terms of ideologies, but there's also additional things that are contemplated and kind of philosophical deliberations that you don't see.
Other ideas, Dan? Never.
Yeah. Can you believe it? I think a lot of people think that if you use the New Testament as kind of the constitution for Christianity, we're really only getting a tiny little fraction of what Christianity as a whole was doing and was thinking. And so to kind of limit it to the boundaries of the text of the New Testament is remarkably reductive and limiting. But that makes it easier to draw boundaries around things. That makes it easier for people to control and to engage in boundary maintenance. And for the most part, most Christians today, I think, are more concerned with the institution of Christianity and maintaining its boundaries than they are with the richness and the depth and the creativity and productiveness of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, something that I love and I specialize in is medieval Christianity, but specifically early medieval, and I've written books on that. And it's almost a completely different religion. Has almost nothing to do with what people, I mean, and we'll get into, because we have a few questions about specifically American Christianity, because that's a whole other sauce. But it used to be so much more, I won't say accepting, but so much more broad strokes as to, and then you see things starting to fracture with the Benedictines and all these different groups.
Yeah.
And then with the synods, people trying to rein things in and trying to define things, and then trying to define the holidays, and then trying to unify, and then there's a split, and then they go, oh no, and then within that split there's another split, and I find that it's when, like anything, it's when people try to desperately grab and hold on to what they think are the values, that things just fracture and they just go all over the place, and you can't control that anymore. I know there's also, and I think
it's, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to just add to that and say, if you look at something like a Quaker meeting versus a Catholic sermon, you would think they're completely different religions.
Oh yeah, that's one thing that I always highlight. I've led a couple of tours in Israel and Palestine, and one of the things that I always make sure to do is to take people to the tomb of Jesus, the sepulcher, but also to the Garden Tomb, because the Garden Tomb is north of Jerusalem, and it is something that was only identified in the 19th century as maybe being where Jesus was buried and where Golgotha is, but it is curated by a Protestant group. And so when you compare the Tomb of the Holy Sepulchre and the din and the smells and the noises and everything to this very, very peaceful, quiet, go have a contemplative moment over here under the trees, and we're going to speak in low tones. Like they're practicing two very different kinds of Christianity that I think resonate with different people in different ways and for different reasons. But yeah, even I've seen Christian congregations and practices in a variety of different parts of the world, and even today you see so much diversity. And I can't imagine what it must have been like as Christianity was spreading around Europe and other parts of the world before they were able to communicate efficiently to the far-flung corners of Christendom. You know, they'd come into a new area, and you negotiate a conversion with a ruler in their community or something like that. But there were a bunch of accommodations that were being made as well, where it's like, hey, you keep doing this thing here, that's fine with us. And so Christianity is practiced in so many very different ways. I think it would be fascinating for American Christians to go see how like Christmas is celebrated in the middle of summer in South America or something like that.
Two of my favorite things. So there are wonderful medieval accounts of like the first Christmases. One of my favorite is, I think it's Nanzinus, where I think it was 325. I believe that's the year 325, where they were trying to, I guess, like 5 years after like Christmas was quote unquote established, and he writes, "Christmas is ruined. We wanted it to be about prayers, and we wanted it to be about God, but instead it's about eating and drinking and falling all out with your family." And that was 5 years after 5 years after Christmas was established, and people are already complaining that Christmas is too commercial and terrible. So but I just imagine you leading people to the sepulchre, to the tomb of Jesus, and then going, "So you see this is fake, because Jews weren't buried like this in first century."
It's funny, we were coming out at one point, and there's that slab. I don't know if you've been there.
I've only seen it. I've not been, no.
Okay, there's a slab right as you come into the entrance, and it's thought to be the place where Jesus' body was laid to be prepared for burial. And we're walking out, and this group is like, "Is that real?" And there are people crying, there are people praying over it, and all this. And I was like, "Let's get outside." And then in a hushed tone, I will explain what's going on.
This is a representation of what? Yeah. You feel bad, you feel horrible, but especially when I have a lot of, as well, we talk a lot about historical fakes and debunking our pseudo archaeology, and one of the biggest ones is the Shroud of Turin, and we all know it was a fake. We literally have the documents where the church literally commissioned it, and then they have the artists. We have artist testimonies. And then much later, they allowed for it to be, I don't know why they did this, but they allowed for it to be dated. And of course, it is completely a fake. And so, but the Pope said, well, it's a representation of, and if you want that, that's great. But you have to accept that. And also, I mean, we wouldn't have that for Jesus, because if Jesus was not, at the time that he lived, we wouldn't have those things. He wasn't a king. He wasn't somebody great. We wouldn't have his artifacts. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Sorry for people who thought it was real. The tomb. Yeah.
There's a materiality to religion and to worship and even to Christianity that a lot of Protestants, I think, lament, but it's there for them as well. That's just that is a part of scratching that kind of intuitive itch that religion is there to scratch. And so I wish more people could just say, this is just it's a representation. It's a way for you to scratch that part of your brain that you need scratched. But so many people want to say, no, it's the actual one. This is, and you
ever go to the River Jordan and get the ablution done?
I have not actually gone in to get baptized, but I have been to the site up north and the site further south, and I've seen people getting baptized. I have stepped in and out of the River Jordan a number of times, but I've held not held in my hand unobstructed, but I have been I have seen tablets from 2000 BCE where you can see a fingerprint in the clay,
That's
and
fantastic.
it's just there's a sensation there that is, I think, so fascinating. I was in the Bodleian Library when I was doing my master's degree at Oxford, and the curator was like, "You want to see something cool?" And he brought out a letter that was signed by Maimonides.
Oh,
So I was
that's
like, that is
awesome.
Maimonides' actual signature.
That's cool.
And yeah, I took a
Super
picture
cool.
of it, and I don't know what happened to it, but that was a spiritual moment for me. I was like, this is something that was touched by Moses Maimonides, and so I can understand how that can be powerful for folks, but I think we would do well to think a little more critically about what's going on there, why this is important to us, and also it doesn't, this does not have to be the actual burial shroud of Jesus.
Yes, it does. Thanks, Dan Brown, for ruining everything forever. Oh,
Yeah,
God.
particularly when it comes to the biblical canon and Nicaea.
Oh, God. Yeah, well, before I get mad, we'll skip to the next question. He's one of those people I just get huffy about, and really not
Yeah.
necessarily him, but it's people who think that they take his books as scripture. You just go. So somebody on YouTube asked, what is the bottomless pit referring to in the book of Revelations? Why did God put Satan in there only to let him out in the thousand years? Why did God just not kill Satan himself if God is God?
Well, it goes back to Enoch. So when you look in the book of Enoch, you've got a part where there are a couple of different kind of tours of the world that Enoch is given. And one part, Enoch is seeing the afterlife. Enoch is seeing an iteration of what would later become hell, where there's fire and all this kind of stuff. But there's one part where Enoch sees a big valley and all these smooth pits. And these are the locations where the righteous are being held, just biding their time until the judgment. And one part, there are 3 pits: one for the righteous, one for the sinners, one for the sinners who did not receive their punishment in life, like for the ones who did not get their comeuppance in life, which raises some interesting questions, because it's like, okay, if those are the ones who weren't punished in life, does that mean that the others were punished in life? Does that mean that they're the sinners, but they have been absolved of their sins? So it raises some interesting questions. But the book of Revelation is adopting a lot of this imagery from the book of Enoch to try to, in order to tell this story in a way that's going to make Greco-Roman period Jewish folks who are familiar with that literature, it's gonna, the tuning fork is going to go off in their loins. They're going to be like, oh yeah, I know what that is. And that's a way to build on the traditions that have come before while also innovating on them and turning it into something new. But and the reason you want to use stuff that people are familiar with is because you then gain purchase on them. You have them and you get your claws in, and then you can then innovate without losing their attention. And so that's what's going on in Revelation. They're basically taking this idea of these big pits that are for the storage of the people until the judgment, and they're saying, okay, now we're going to turn this into a single pit, and it's really only for devil and his angels, and then they're all going to get thrown into the lake of fire. And then so it's and when people try to align their modern concept of hell with the book of Revelation, that's doubly problematic, because the hell itself gets thrown into the lake of fire in the book of Revelation. So it's like, well, aren't they both hell? What's going on here? So it's bizarre apocalyptic imagery that is primarily there to evoke kind of an emotional response more than it is to try to lay out some kind of systematic soteriological narrative.
It's also very selfish of Satan to take up so much real estate.
Yeah.
Considering hell is a physical space, it's very rude of him to just be like, no, this is mine now. There's even
just
a housing
appropriation
crisis.
from top to bottom.
housing crisis in hell. Next question. What is Gnosticism? When were the Gnostic texts written? Are Gnostics Christians, or are they considered to be a separate religious entity? What is their connection to Yahweh and the demiurge? How did Eliphaz Levi know what they looked like?
Well, I can answer the last question first. Made up.
Yeah, he made it up.
Made it up. But Gnosticism is a tradition that we see late first century, early second century CE. It's arising. Its origins are a little fuzzy. There are folks who think that it originated with Christianity. There are folks who think it originated within Judaism. But basically, it's taking some of the cosmology of Middle Platonism, which is based, I think the main insight from Middle Platonism that is being applied here is that the material world, the world of the flesh, is corrupt and changing, whereas the world of the divine world is spiritual, incorruptible, and eternal and unchanging. And so everybody's goal is for their divine spirits to overcome the fleshly world, the material world, and then ascend back to the pleroma, the fullness, to be a part of this spiritual, eternal, unchanging mass. And when you overlay that Middle Platonism on the Bible, what you get is this understanding that, Adonai in the Hebrew Bible is responsible for the creation of the material world. And so that must mean that Adonai is a bad deity, that Adonai is doing something wrong. And so you get this narrative that kind of develops out of this overlay of Middle Platonism on the Hebrew Bible that sees Adonai as the demiurge who is creating the world of the flesh to trap divine spirits in these fleshly bodies so that they can serve the interests of the demiurge. So it's like a JV squad deity going off and like, I'm going to do my own thing. And then within Christianity, Jesus is represented as presenting this way to overcome everything through knowledge. So you have to understand what's going on and gain knowledge in order to overcome the flesh and transcend it and return to the pleroma. And so you get Gnostic literature primarily arising in the second century CE that is kind of riffing on what we have in the Gospels and other traditions that would have been in circulation that for whatever reason didn't get written down. And yeah, I would say if to the degree they identified as Christians, absolutely they were Christians. And I think you have a whole spectrum between like Gnostics and Christians, where there are certainly folks who are like, I get some of what they're saying. I can accept some of that, but I also think some of what's going on over here is also true. And so just like in, 17th and 18th century America, you had some Christians who were also deists. Mm-hmm. And, maybe you had some deists who were like, I'm not Christian. I don't think they ever identified as deists, but deism was another thing that's kind of interconnected with Christianity in certain ways. And so I don't think it's as binary as a lot of people think. But certainly those that identified as Christians, I think, were absolutely Christians. And I think that's a manifestation of that desire to kind of curate boundaries for the sake of the institution, for us to wag our fingers at certain heretics and say, no, you don't get to be called a Christian. And, that kind of thing is still going on today.
Yeah, there are. I'm sure you've heard. There you go.
My friend David Congdon's got a wonderful book, Who is a True Christian? Contesting Religious Identity in American Culture, which I think does a phenomenal job of discussing a lot of the complexities of that question.
I do. There are a lot of people who ask, are Jehovah's Witnesses Christian, or are they Jehovah's? Are the Mormons Christian, or are they people of the Latter-day Saints, right? There's this whole question of, again, finger pointing of who gets to be considered to be a Christian. And there's even, especially as I'm sure your friend goes into in the book, a lot of finger pointing about European Catholicism versus American Protestantism and all that kind of thing.
Somebody April LaJoy made a video earlier where she's responding to somebody who said, can Christians date Catholics? And she was like, can colors date blue? Can athletes date basketball players? Can furniture date couches?
We
Can they, JD?
we
So
laugh, but but if even in places, let's say like Ireland, just a couple of centuries ago, they wouldn't Protestants wouldn't date Catholics. I mean,
oh yeah,
there's a lot of political reasons why that happened, but
yeah.
nobody nowadays cares about it. If but
Well, watch the Dairy Girls, and
oh
then
yes,
you'll
yeah,
you'll care big time.
yeah,
Such a wonderful show.
yeah, it is. And but Sister Michael is my Christ. I love her so much, so much.
She's
She's
great.
wonderful. It's that humor in religion I really love. But here's a good question. Speaking of what certain people in the Christian sphere can and cannot do. When did pork become forbidden? And if we know that ancient Israelites actually ate it, we do have archaeological evidence that they ate it. We do have evidence for pork being eaten in antiquity amongst Judeans and Canaanite peoples of the region. So why is it suddenly forbidden in text? And I just want to clarify that this is not just a Jewish thing. Even Ethiopian Christians, certain Ethiopian Christians don't eat pork. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Jonathan Adler's new book, The Origins of Judaism, makes the case that we don't see any of the identity markers for what we now generally understand as Judaism until around the middle of the 2nd century BCE. That, for instance, you don't see a programmatic avoidance of pork consumption until around that time. And his theory, that I think is interesting, is that the Torah was not widely known about, much less enforced, until around the rise of the Hasmonean kingdom. With the Maccabees. They suddenly had their independence back. They're a kingdom again. This is they probably thought of this as the fulfillment of these prophecies about the return and restoration and all of this. And so the scriptures that were available to them were probably suddenly used as an identity marker, a way to create and curate the boundaries around this new identity. And so they began to try to enforce, to the degree that they could, these cultural expectations to celebrate these festivals and holidays and things like that, which is also why you immediately begin to see attempts to harmonize everything in the Hebrew Bible, and you start to get your halakhic and other literature developing, debating, what are we going to do about this? These things contradict. There's no answer to this question over here.
There's still no answer, Dan. There's no answer.
Yeah, because there's no univocality, obviously. But
yeah.
But I think that's the answer to that question that I think is the most intriguing, is the notion that this probably began in the middle of the 2nd century CE as a means of establishing a firm boundary to Jewish identity for the new fledgling Hasmonean kingdom.
I know there are some scholars as well that say that it might have to do something with the ancient what is it in English? Philistines. I was going to say Philistine. So something to do with them, because they after kingdoms moved around, some things were established, that the Philistine were very big on pork because of where they came from. And so but we don't really have a lot of scholarship. We don't really have a lot of archaeological evidence that there was that split. So we don't know.
Right. Really, yeah. Sure. You see more pork consumption among the Philistines than you do in locations that are identified as Israelite.
Right. Exactly.
But what you don't see is any kind of programmatic de jure avoidance of pork.
Here's a question that gets both of us in trouble, Dan, all the time. What is the historicity of King David?
I think there was probably a David who, I don't think he was a king. I think he was a warlord or something like that, a mercenary. Certainly he led a band of mercenaries. And in my opinion, he probably tried to usurp the throne in the north and failed, and went south and was able to take over Jerusalem. And so probably set up a chiefdom in the southern kingdom. And so we see in the Tel Dan stele, which dates to the middle of the 8th century BCE, the Aramaean Hazael claims to have defeated all these kings, and refers to kings of Israel, and then refers to somebody who is of the house of David, which suggests a dynasty rather than a kingdom that is equivalent to what's going on in the north. So I think that provides indirect evidence that there was at least a tradition about a Davidic dynasty, a century to a century and a half after the traditional dating of King David. So I think there's pretty good support for the historicity of somebody who becomes identified with King David. But the traditions that we have in the Bible are heavily elaborated on, and I'm sure in many cases just entirely made up.
Yeah, like
But
Goliath. I mean, that
yeah,
story was lifted from
from
somewhere else.
Elchanan.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
and even the story of Naboth and Abigail. If you take out, in the Bible, it's like David says, "Hey, we've been protecting your flocks. We just want some food as compensation." And Naboth's like, rah, 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 and just runs them off. And then they come to Abigail, and they're like, "Hey, we're trying to be." Your husband's being a jerk to us. We just and then God kills Naboth, and it's like that sounds like a protection racket where they were like, "Hey, give us stuff so that we can protect you from what we're going to do to you if you don't give us stuff." And Naboth probably got himself killed. And then David said, "Ooh, that's a pretty wife you had there. I'm going to take her." And then later on, this gets altered to this divine intervention where David's like, "Far be it from me to do any violence to anybody."
David was not a good person. He was a bad.
No.
Even I was to the credit of my teachers when I was growing up, they were very clear that David was problematic, and that he was, even though he was a quote unquote king or made himself king, we're not sure. He did bad things, and he did not do things in the right way.
Aaron Higashi just published a wonderful commentary called First and Second Samuel for Normal People. So it's in Pete Enz's The Bible for Normal People commentary series, and the subtitle is A Guide to Prophets, Kings, and Some Pretty Terrible Men. And so
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it talks about how awful a person David was, but and there have been some other treatments of the historical David. Joel Baden wrote one.
What I really
wrote one.
What I really want is the relationship study between him and Jonathan. That's what I want. I want hashtag King David was gay everywhere. That's what I want.
Yeah, and I think all of these Jacob, Joel, Aaron point out this seems like a pretty intense relationship. We can't know for sure, but I don't think there's any reason to doubt that there could have been a homosexual romantic relationship going on between the two, and that is still centuries away from the holiness code that would say no, we don't like that. That's centuries before that. And if you're a powerful king, you can get away with Bathsheba and everything that's going on there. If you can get away with that, you can get away with a homosexual relationship.
Actually, I mean, his relationship with Jonathan is so much more healthy than his relationship with Bathsheba.
At least the way it's represented, yeah.
Yeah, and he see the story is like when he sees her, dancing on a roof. He goes, "Yes, that one. I want that one." You go, "Yeah, but like she's married, dude. Like that's not okay." "I don't care. Yeah. I want that one."
Yeah, nobody says anything to him. Like he's like, "Go get me." They're like, "Yes, sir," and they go do what the king says.
So wrong in so many ways.
Absolutely, yeah.
But again, that's if those stories actually did happen, which many of them probably didn't. Yeah,
because the saying, "Well, David had a relationship with Jonathan," is also saying, "Hey, Jonathan would have been next in line for the throne," but Jonathan is like, "No, my man David is the one who should be." And like, it's propaganda for David's accession to the throne as well. So, so the historicity of that relationship is also problematic.
Yeah, David was just screwing the hype man. That's all he was doing.
Yeah.
Oh, here's another spicy question that I have been disinvited to so many Purim tishes, Dan. I cannot tell you. What is the historicity behind the writing of Megillat Esther? Were Mordecai and Esther real people, or were they based on Marduk and Ishtar?
I think the consensus view would be that this is a Persian period novella that is just creating this story to kind of bring comfort to Jewish folks who are trying to live within, under the boot of a larger empire. And yeah, I think most scholars say that their names are etymologically descended from Marduk and Ishtar.
As
I
well,
don't think there's a
the
strong case
customs
to
as
make against that.
well. We can
Yeah.
trace to around like 13th, 14th century Italy, and dressing up and everything around the time of Lenten Carnival. Very suspicious. And again, as I always say, because we always do this on all of our other things. I always say people make new traditions, people make new holidays all the time. You want to make a new
Oh, yeah.
holiday and celebrate it? Wonderful. Dan and I celebrate Comic-Con. That's the best holiday of all. Amazing. We dress up, we have a great time, and there's no problem with that. The problem is, is saying, oh yes, this is an ancient tradition that everybody did since ancient times. It is absolutely impossible, and there's no evidence for it.
Yeah. And I think there's what was it? Was it the Torah.com? I think on April Fool's Day several years ago, they ran an article saying that Megillot Esther was discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh,
and
that's
like to this day, and you can tell it's a joke. Like it's telling it in a very by the end of the article,
though.
it's a joke. Yeah, but it's so funny because so many people thought it was real. And shared that article.
I hope they take, because now with AI scrubbing the internet, oh god, that's going to be a nightmare to get through. Oh man. So, speaking of holidays, why are the Book of Maccabees or Books of Maccabees not in the Jewish canon if they tell the story of Hanukkah?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think there are some folks who probably think that the book is taking a particular stance on the legitimacy of the priesthood, particularly the temple priesthood, and maybe there were some sensitivities about that. Another argument is that while it was probably originally written in Hebrew or maybe Aramaic, it was really circulating primarily in Greek around that time period, and maybe they didn't think it went back to Hebrew. I think that's one of the criterion that was used, was that they were available in Hebrew, and maybe they had lost track of Hebrew manuscripts or didn't think that it was originally written in Hebrew. But certain, and then there's also the idea that they, if I recall, there was kind of a date cutoff that again might have been kind of a post hoc rationalization, but there's an idea that they weren't accepting things that were written after like 400 BCE or something like that, even though Daniel is from the mid 2nd century BC.
Don't tell them. I think as well. I think the books had to be completed as one of these stipulations, and from my memory, I don't think Maccabim Gimel, the third one, is completed, or that we don't have the whole thing, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, of third Maccabees?
I think that's what but that was like 15 years. We might have the whole thing now. I'm not sure if things were discovered, but that is what I was told, is that we didn't have the whole thing, so therefore it was not it wasn't put in. But it also has nothing to there's also no how should I say this? There's no mention of the miracle and the specific 8 days, and so some people might not like that, and therefore
I think you might have I know there are a lot of Christians who really like second Maccabees, because chapters 7 and 8 kind of introduce an idea of vicarious sacrificial atonement. So that might be another thing that might have made some folks sensitive in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE.
Also, if you think about the historicity of Hanukkah and what it really is, it's really a civil war. That's what the story is, and some people don't like to be reminded of that at all.
And I know a lot of people think that the candles were originally a way of towing the line.
Oh, that's spicy. I never heard that. We're going to go
through the city. If you don't have the candles in the window, you're not one of us.
Spicy. I never heard that one before. Interesting. Yeah. I'll have to put that in my pocket and save it for another day. Speaking of things that are going to get us in trouble. So why are American legislators talking about 10 commandments and not this is really my feeling as well, and not the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach? Also, which Ten Commandments are they referring to? If there are more, if we know there are technically more than 10. So, for example, I always was taught that pruervu is the first, or be fruitful and multiply is technically the first commandment. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of the Ten Commandments, because in other places they're not called the Ten Commandments. They're called, they're called the something like the Tablets of Agreement, right? I guess is the translation. So
Mm-hmm.
why are they so fixed on these Ten Commandments, and why do they completely forget about the seven mitzvot b'nai Noah?
Well, they're not engaging the whole conceptual package. They're drawing this from the mid 20th century, because in the 1950s we had a judge, and I'm blanking on the judge's name,
Mm-hmm.
but he was sentencing a 16-year-old car thief, and didn't want to throw him in jail. And so what he came up with was he wanted him to carry around a copy of the Ten Commandments and regularly look at them. And he thought that was a pretty cool resolution. And so he started doing this as a habit. And he got in with a guy named Cecil B. DeMille.
No. Oh no,
And
Dan, you can't. It's one of my favorite movies. You can't. You can't. Please.
and a group called the Fraternal Order of Eagles. And
Okay.
they began to produce these posters that had the Ten Commandments on them, a specific isolation of the commandments in a specific translation. And they began to publish these as a way to combat the Red Scare and say the godless communists on the other side of the ocean need to be compartmentalized. We need to show that we are people of God, and an identity marker that can help us accomplish that is the Ten Commandments. This shows that we are people of God, and we are founded in morality, and we're founded in a specific law code. And so he got together with the Fraternal Order of Eagles, got together with Cecil B. DeMille, and they created hundreds of monumental inscriptions of the Ten Commandments, and they were placed in parks and in public spaces and near courthouses all over the United States, including in Texas. There was, and oh gosh, I don't think it's Austin. I don't remember which.
This was all advertising for the Ten Commandments movie.
Well, that's what DeMille was getting out of it. But it was a campaign again as part of the Red Scare. This was the same time period that they put in God We Trust on the money. This is the same time period in which suddenly America was a Bible-based and a Ten Commandment-based society. And when in the early 2000s, somebody was like, hey, we shouldn't have the Ten Commandments in a courthouse. And it went to the Supreme Court, and it's a long, dumb story. But basically, there was a specific version of the Ten Commandments where one justice was the swing vote and allowed them to remain. And so what they're talking about now, where they're saying, oh, we got to have the Ten Commandments in every classroom, it is word for word the exact same version that was in that courthouse in Texas, which was the exact same version that DeMille and the Fraternal Order of Eagles made over 70 years ago, because it has precedence. And so if it has precedence, they are confident they're going to get away with it. And particularly with our new Supreme Court right-wing authoritarian majority. And so it's just a way to it's just an identity marker. It's a way to say, we are in control of this space. And if you're going to be in this space, you're going to follow our rules. So it's Christian nationalism. It's knuckle dragging right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. But it sounds like this superintendent in Oklahoma who's like, every classroom's going to have a Bible, and we're going to read from the Bible, and because they quoted the Bible in the Declaration of Independence, which they didn't.
No,
and
they never did.
Bible, they never did, and they quoted the Bible in the Federalist Papers. No, they didn't.
No, they didn't.
And just a bunch of nonsense. He's actually now being there's an investigation going on, because in addition to being a Christian nationalist, he's also evidently a terrible state superintendent who does not follow any of the rules.
Such surprise.
Yeah, can you imagine? So yeah, that stuff annoys me so much because one, the Ten Commandments play absolutely no role in American jurisprudence. And even like you want to go back to the founding of America, they didn't care about the Ten Commandments. Even Thomas Jefferson said, "Hey, our laws are not based on Christianity." He actually went back and said, "Look, you can go look back before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, and English common law actually descends from pre-Anglo-Saxon law, and it has nothing to do with Christianity." Like he was very concerned with that. So yeah, the people who think the Bible and the Ten Commandments sit at the foundation of our nation or of its legal system.
Not only that, but every time they bring that up, I just go, I immediately know they haven't read it. Because they're all out here coveting each other's wives, and I'm going,
yeah. And these are all folks who want to put into office a profoundly stupid racist who has violated proudly literally the majority of the Ten Commandments. Like stealing, check. Adultery, check. Coveting your neighbor's wife, check. Violating the Sabbath, double check. You've got so much in there that taking the name of God in vain, however you interpret
that, yeah, exactly.
Multiple checks. So the hypocrisy there is just breathtaking.
Yep. I don't envy you. I'm very sorry that you have to deal with that. I apologize. Okay, so we're in the last third of the questions.
Okay.
So let's have another diatribe. Is there any truth to the lost tribes of Israel? Were there actually 12, or is this number taken from another source? What about the Samaritans and the Ethiopian Beta Israel who claim to be descended from Menelech?
So there absolutely was a kingdom of Israel that either Sennacherib V or Sargon II carted off, forced migration back into Assyria, and they probably scattered them around Assyria, basically destroying their shared identity. They could not organize, they could not perpetuate that shared identity. And so whatever comprised the northern kingdom of Israel prior to 722 BCE, that identity was destroyed by the Assyrians. It is not plausible, in my opinion, for there to have survived any discernible tribal identity after that. And so there are a lot of genetic tests that go on these days to try to determine some kind of relationship to that land. And I think the consensus view is that Jewish folks as well as Palestinian folks both have genetic roots that go all the way back into the Bronze Age and earlier. So they both have equal claim to parts of that land. So that particular question is not one that can be resolved through genetics. But I think there's been some indication that there's been migration in and out of Africa from the Levant for a long, long time. So while there are some genetic markers of Levantine blood in Ethiopia, and particularly within what do they call themselves? The Beta Israel.
Beta Israel,
yeah. The traditions that go along with them, so like that Solomon had a child with the Queen of Sheba and all that kind of stuff. None of that's supported by any data.
No, we had to talk about that on when we had the two archaeologists on. We were talking about we'll get to like what happened to the Ark of the Covenant, but one of the stories is that it went there. But yeah, there's a whole tradition around that. I love that.
They've got a little chapel where nobody's allowed in, but they say it's in there. Yeah,
I love that for them. I love that for them. Please explain, if you can, the confusing story of Tzipporah and the inn, and how Moses meets God and God wants to kill him.
I cannot. That's the short answer. Nobody knows for sure what's going on here, although it seems to be drawing inspiration from other traditions about malevolent divine figures trying to kill people for whatever reason. And this, in my opinion, this seems to be a scary story to tell in the dark about why circumcision is important. But what exactly inspires it? I don't know.
I know because I only heard about the story later, and I thought, are we reading the same books? What?
Yeah, a lot of I think it's funny when a lot of people actually read the Bible and are suddenly like, I didn't know about a lot of this stuff, but that was a great one. And then if you read it in the Septuagint or in the Targumim, it's like angels of God met Moses and tried to kill him, and it's like, oh, okay, now we're blaming it on angels. We
Yeah,
don't
that's
want to blame
fine. That
God.
makes it totally
Yeah.
fine. Yeah.
Which and this is something I talk about in my book,
Plug your
Adonai's
book.
Divine
Plug your
Images.
book. Where's your book?
Oh yeah, Adonai's Divine Images. Which, by the way, I don't make a dime off of any of this because this is an open access book. The contract has the remuneration section, and it says you get 10 free hard copies. End of remuneration.
Great.
So yeah, so go fight. You can Google the title and get the PDF for free online. But I talk about how there is a long tradition of using the angel as the scapegoat or the fall guy for stuff where it's really God, but you don't want God to be there for whatever reason. So
yeah, and so now it's Gabriel or Samael or pick one.
Yeah,
pick one.
Pick an angel, and then write it on a bowl or something and curse somebody. But yeah, so I argue that the angel of Adonai or the angel of Elohim, which we find with like Hagar, with Abraham, with Moses, with Gideon, with Manoach and his wife, and Joshua in the battle, those were all originally God themselves, and somewhere along the way, and wrote in Malach instead because they didn't like the idea of God sitting down by the campfire for a nice little piece of fish or something. So
that's great. Is this one?
But in Exodus 4:24, it's like they didn't like the idea of God saying, "I'm going to kill you, Moses," for no discernible
reason. He didn't even. It sounds not like at that point, he hit the rock or anything. This is just for no reason. It's just the strangest thing ever.
Until his wife's like, "Hey, come here." What are you doing?
Oh, it's great. This question reads kind of like a Seinfeld question. So, what's the deal with Benjamin? What's the deal with Binyamin and werewolfism? Also,
werewolfism?
So Esav also is said to be very hairy. What does the Bible have against werewolves and or hairy people?
Not a big fan of bears, but I werewolves, I don't know about that. If they're talking about the tribe of Benjamin, I think there are a lot of different ideas about why Benjamin is kind of glomming onto to Judah in the south. Yeah, and I don't know the origins of that. I would point people to Andrew Tobolowsky's book on the 12 tribes of Israel, or to Jason Staples' book on the 12 tribes of Israel. I think they'll have much better information than I'm able to provide. But as far as Esau goes, I thought that was supposed to be an etiology for the Edomites, wasn't it, or something like that? That they're the red people, and so,
the red hair,
yeah, and he sells his birthright for a pot of red. So I figured that was the association there. I don't know if there's anything deeper than that going on.
Yeah,
I tend to think a lot of stories are kind of often more simple than people want to make them.
Yes.
Like the curse of the serpent in Genesis 3. People are like, oh, it's this grand story of Jesus. And it's like, no, it's why people don't like snakes.
Yeah,
that's really all it is.
That's really it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I have a friend who is very, very much, she grew up Baptist. She's not Baptist anymore, but she still has a love for the academic aspect of the Bible. And so she always asks me, she's like, is this Satan? Is this really Satan? And I'm like, no, it's not. I'm sorry. It's really it's a snake, or you could say a legless serpent. Some people interpret it that way as well. It's really not Satan. I'm sorry.
Yeah. If it's in the Hebrew Bible, it's not Satan.
Nope.
Like the best you got is Hasatan, which is just like an assignment. Yeah. But yeah, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is nowhere identified as Satan. And I think the only the argument is made that one of the Odes of Solomon, and I'm forgetting which one, 23 or 24, I forget which one.
You would know better
There's a
than me. It's somewhere in Shir Hashirim, but I can't remember which piece.
well, the Odes of Solomon, not the Song of
Oh,
Solomon.
not songs. Okay.
No, the Odes of Solomon. So an apocryphal text. There's a mention about the one who a jealous one, a Diabolos, a devil who introduced jealousy into the world or something like that. And people are like, oh, that must be the serpent in the Garden of Eden being identified as the devil. But there are an awful lot of scholars who say, no, in this book, there's no talk of the devil at all. And Diabolos is a word for a slanderer. And if you look in the narrative, the person who introduces, is brought death into the world. Through jealousy, brought death into the world. It's like, if you look in the narrative, the person who first killed another person because of envy, that was Cain and Abel.
Yes, yeah.
And so I think most scholars today would say, no, that's talking about Cain killing Abel, introducing death into the world that way because of his envy. That's that God looked favorably on his offering. And so you don't get an identification of the serpent as Satan until like the 2nd or 3rd century CE within Christianity. So a lot of people really don't like that. Oh, and then they'll go to Revelation, where it calls Satan that ancient serpent, that dragon.
Oh no,
with 7 heads, and it's like, that's Leviathan.
It's Leviathan. We talked about that actually. We talked about the history of dragons and how it really does. Yeah, it does go back to Leviathan. Also, it goes back to Cetus and whales in the sea and things like that. Possibly the steam, or possibly their emissions being mistaken for fire and things like that. That's pretty cool. I love all this stuff.
I do too.
Ooh, so more spicy questions that get us in trouble. What is the historical evidence for a Moses or a Moses-like figure, considering that his name cannot be an ancient Hebrew word due to the time period difference? Was he a real person, or did he have a different name at the time of Ramses II, or is he completely made up? Oh, my favorite little addendum to this is, why do people think he had horns? And what is the Apocalypse of Moses, and who wrote it?
We obviously don't know who wrote it, but that is a pseudepigraphical text that is about and kind of apocalyptic end times vision associated with Moses. The data don't support the historicity of the Moses who is described in the book of Exodus or the events of the book of Exodus. Now, having said that, the apologists who want there to have been a historical Exodus have to commit to either an early date or a late date, a date around 1400 BCE or a date around 1200 BCE. And the 1200ers prefer that date because that's where Ramses is closest to. But the only piece of evidence that could potentially have anything to do with the historical Moses would be Moses's name, because we do see that in Egyptian, only it means born of or son of. And so there should be a theophoric element attached to the name. And so the argument goes, Moses's name originally had an Egyptian deity's name as the theophoric element, but because of embarrassment, it fell out, leaving only Moses, which was then interpreted as related to the verb for to draw out, but was originally an Egyptian.
Yeah, it can't be. It's not possible, right? Because of ancient Hebrew is not around at that time period. Yeah.
Well, Hebrew doesn't develop until well after either, whichever date you want, the early or the late date. Hebrew hasn't developed yet, and so that is one argument for there having been some kind of historical figure named Moses. And there are scholars who suggest that this tradition is based on an ancient historical account where somebody led a small, we're talking single digits or dozens of people out of slavery in Egypt, or there's even a theory that they escaped from slavery in the Northern Hill Country and set up shop. And their tradition over the centuries just grew and grew and grew into what we have today. So that's a plausibility, but I think most folks would say that this is most scholars would say that the Book of Exodus is fiction.
I know that there's a lot of scholars who also say that this is either a cultural memory of like the Exodus from Babylon, Or there's also an idea that it's possible that Moses was originally like a monotheist in Egypt and had a few followers, but again, we don't really know.
Yeah, that, and I think the idea that like Akhenaten was the originator of monotheism, I think that depends on a specific understanding of monotheism that I don't think works. But certainly the story of the Exodus has a new resonance once the Judahites are returning to the land of Israel. And so I think certainly there are literary layers that date to that late. But it seems to me that the tradition itself, in some form or another, probably originates much earlier than that, probably somewhere around the 8th or 7th century BCE.
This question I love. I love the answer to this question. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant?
It was probably melted down for parts by the Babylonians, if it still existed.
Yeah, we don't know. Yeah, because when Nebuchadnezzar comes and trashes the first temple, he doesn't mention it.
Yeah,
you would think that it's the thing that you would go there. You would go, ha ha, I captured, because other people did capture, but they didn't.
And we have the Mesha inscription where Mesha says he carted off the vessels of Adonai and before Chemosh. And so that's what you did when you defeated somebody and sacked their temple. But I happen to be of the opinion, and again, I talk about this in my book. Again, open access, find it for free online. That the Ark of the Covenant was probably originally a shrine model, that it was intended as a miniaturized sacred space where miniaturized divine images were kept inside. And so I point to the temple of Arad in the Negev, which has a standing stone, which would have been the divine image in the Cella, in the Holy of Holies. And what is if you had two standing stones and you made miniature standing stones, what would they look like? Well, they would look like tablets. And so shrine models contain miniature divine images, and if you have miniature standing stones, you have two tablets. You would stick them inside the Ark of the Covenant, and that would be the little miniaturized, mobilized sacred space. And then you even see in Deuteronomy and in Joshua, it happens with Moses and it happens with Joshua, you see a blending of divine images where they write the law on standing stones. And so standing stone is the traditional divine image. We're going to write the law on the standing stone. What happens if we miniaturize two standing stones with the law written on them? Oh, we get two little tablets with the law written on it. And that facilitates the worship of Adonai in Deuteronomy and in the book of Joshua. And so I suggest that's what's going on, but that was probably very, very early. And who knows, Mesha could have been the one who absconded with the Ark of the Covenant, or it could have happened at any time after that, maybe in 722 BCE when Sennacherib the fifth or Sargon came in.
Yeah, I mean, it disappears. I mean, it was the most important object for about 500 years, and then it's completely gone. I mean, we know it was in Shiloh for a very long time, and then it went to like Kiryat Yarim, and there's been tons of archaeological things, because that's a very important cult site. And we know that things were there, but we do not know. And obviously, we have texts that say, that there were Israelites who looked in it and they died. What was in there?
That was at Beit Shemesh. I've been to Beit Shemesh a handful of times, and it's very bizarre to go pull over on the side of the road. Like, it's just kind of a little. It just looks like a hill, and then you go out. You go walking around, it's like there are potsherds everywhere, and you see the outlines of these ruins of buildings, and it's like, oh, this is 3,000 years old. And here's an aquifer that is gigantic. And,
did you find the Nazis there digging around? Look.
They were in the wrong place. But
and then, as you said before, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, the group that I was with there, I was like, all right, this is where the Philistines, after they were struck with hemorrhoids, they were like, get that thing out of here. Yeah. And stuck it on a cart and tied some cows to the cart, and the cows were just like, and they came here and then just stopped. And that's where they had.
The most interesting, well, I think there was that fear behind what the Ark of the Covenant is, and then after it was, according to the text, after it was put in the Beit HaMikdash, only the priest on one day a year could actually go in there and see it. But what was actually in there, we don't know. We don't even know how big it was. We know that there are
Yeah,
like cherubim on it, but that's it. We don't know.
yeah,
Then as well, I think it's in Yirmiyah where they start, when they're talking about the building of the second temple, and they even say, should we make another one? Should we make another Ark of the Covenant? And the answer is no. They don't.
yeah.
They decide that they don't want another one. So there must have been something. There must have been either a change in the religion, a change in something. So this way they decide they don't need this moving representation of their deity. Maybe you see it in modern Shinto as well, where they take the kami-sama, and they take it around in the movable thing, and then they bring it
Hmm.
back to the temple. So I mean, this idea of a movable deity was not it's not only an Israelite thing, and even in Egypt they had representations on barks
Yeah,
of
yeah, the solar
deities.
bark.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and that's and there are folks who argue that that was the inspiration for the Ark of the Covenant. But you have Ezekiel 1. God gets a set of wheels, so God is otherwise mobilized anyway. So they don't need the Ark of the Covenant because of
It's true. I
somebody
know.
who is obviously well and truly baked on the banks of the great river.
Acacia bush fumes, so great. Uh,
Well, they discovered three different types of cannabis on the small incense altar at the Arad temple. So
oh yeah, absolutely,
they
for
were,
sure.
yeah, they
That they
were
were smoking.
hotboxing in the Judahite temple.
Makes total sense. I mean, especially if you're going to commune with God, obviously.
Yeah,
All they need now are some shrooms to get the party really started.
yeah. All I need is some Nutella and some Biscoff cookie butter, and I had a sandwich made of that, and I saw the face of God. So
Oh, I believe it.
that was all I
Absolutely.
need. But when you go back to the high priest goes in once a year, the text is also like, fill that mother up with incense smoke so you can't see a thing.
Yeah,
So there's
exactly.
a lot of obscuring going on. So they and who knows if the ark was in there? They probably, the last thing the high priest wanted to do was stub his toe against the Ark of the Covenant or something.
Yeah, it could be that they lost it at some point because, as I said, there we don't have a record of it being in the first temple at all. That it just it's something happened where they made Jerusalem the center, or the temple the center of their worship, and then it just completely disappears.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to ask questions about it. So I mean,
Well,
maybe.
I think it was probably gone by the time of Josiah, because he's the one who centralizes all worship in the
Mhm.
Jerusalem temple. And so the fact that there is no discussion of that probably suggests by that time they were already like, all right, well, we can't find that, so we're just gonna quietly ignore that.
So here's a question about your favorite translation and mine. Not really. Was the King James Bible responsible for the mistranslation of Ta'ana with reference to Mary? If the King James Bible is not a good translation, which one is better?
The mistranslation of Tana
Yeah,
with reference to
Ta'ana. I don't know if this is the right translation, but they're asking, was the King James Bible responsible for the mistranslation of young woman, the word Ta'ana?
like Alma in Isaiah 7.
I suppose.
Okay.
If
Is that
the
because Mary,
if it's not comprehensible, we could just skip it.
because well, there is the idea that that Mary was that Isaiah 7:14 prophesies about a virgin is with child and
Hmm.
will bring forth a son, and his name will be called Emmanuel. And no, the King James version is not responsible for that.
Oh, okay.
That pre-exists the King James version by quite a lot. The King James version is not responsible for a ton of things, because King James version is a very conservative revision of the Bishop's Bible, which came before it. And so most of the time when people say King James added this verse or changed this verse or did this about witches or that or the other thing, if you go look, you will see that it says the exact same thing in several translations that came before the King James
But I
version
don't
most
want to
of
look,
the
Dan. I want
time.
I want somebody to tell me the answer.
um, but there are lots of better translations than the King James version. I generally recommend the New Revised Standard Version, and there's an updated edition that came out last year that I think does a good job. And I usually recommend. Right now, I'm recommending what's called the SBL Study Bible, which has wonderful introductions to the books, wonderful explanatory notes, and even little mini essays as sidebars scattered throughout the text.
Is that the one you have an essay in?
It is the one I have an essay in. I wrote an essay on the names of God for BibleOdyssey.org, which is associated with SBL, and they just stuck it in Exodus 3. So I even have a pretty choice spot in the Bible as well. But I think that's the best one currently because it has the updated edition of the NRSV. The New Oxford Annotated Bible, the 5th edition, is several years old. It does not have the updated edition, but they're working on that. And so probably within the next year or two, they'll release a 6th edition of the New Oxford Annotated Bible, and my allegiance will probably shift to that.
but for now.
But for now, I recommend the SBL Study Bible.
When was the Christian concept of hell invented? Is it because of Dante's Inferno that hell is hot and not cold? When was purgatory invented, and why? Who decided that heaven was up and hell was down? Well, I know was in Paul says something about the heavens being up, or like where Jesus coming from.
The heaven was always up. I mean, the Hebrew word shemaim refers to the skies, and so that is a very, very old idea. Now, hell, you don't have hell in the Hebrew Bible. You have Sheol, which is the abode of the dead, which was understood as underground, and it was understood as dark and dreary. But then what happened? The Enochic literature happened, and we have kind of competing imagery because it talks about the wicked being kept in darkness where it's cold, but they also talk about the wicked being kept in flames of fire. So you have competing ideas there, and so the Book of First Enoch is where I think you get the seeds of the concept of hell. But by the time you get to the New Testament, there are 3 ideas about divine punishment of the wicked. There's annihilationism, which is just the idea that God destroys the wicked. They don't exist at all anymore. There is temporary conscious torment followed either by annihilation or by salvation. There's a brand of universalism that we see in some early Christianity, including within Gnosticism, that holds that once you get adequately punished, then you're free, or once you get adequately punished, you cease to exist. And then there's eternal conscious torment, and it's not systematic in the New Testament. All 3 of those ideas kind of bubble to the surface in different ways within the New Testament, within early Christianity, and I think it's within late antique Christianity and into medieval Christianity that we really hammer out and systematize this notion of hell as eternal conscious torment, which involves flames and things like that. But the idea of a river of fire, a lake of fire, the idea of this giant pit. These things all come from kind of a mashing up of First Enoch, as well as some of the stuff from Greek ideas about the afterlife.
Purgatory, I know, was talked about in and around like 1100, and I know the Second Council of Leon in 1274 is when they think they really defined what purgatory was.
Did they? Okay, good.
Yeah.
And that can be the idea of temporary torment followed by salvation it's just a lateral move toward purgatory. And you have I know that one of the reasons that some people think Luther did not like the Apocrypha is because 2 Maccabees chapter 12, I think it's around verse 42 or something like that. Judah Maccabee, his forces come upon the bodies of other compatriots, but they find either coins or some other kinds of divine images on their persons, and they're like, uh-oh, they've been sinning. And then they pass the hat around to send an offering to the temple on behalf of the deceased, which suggests that their souls are in some kind of limbo. They have not been assigned to one place or another, and the idea is that somehow they can affect their salvation after their death through money. or vicarious temple sacrifices. So,
or by prayer, like physically going to the space and making prayers and offerings.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know that you just did a podcast on this, so we'll go through it quickly. When was the rapture invented and why? What does it have to do with the prophecy of Daniel? Now, something I did notice, because you just had Data Over Dogma had what was it? That the rapture is not coming. I think that's the title of it. Yeah, and so something that we learn here in Canada is about the Great Disappointment. Do you know what the Great Disappointment is, Dan?
That was a prognostication about the end times coming, and then everybody was looking forward to it, and it didn't happen.
Yeah, that's the Millerite movement. It's great. It's amazing. So that was a big thing here in Canada. And
Nice.
Mr. Miller, he said that Jesus was going to appear October 22nd. I don't know how he calculated this. There are people who know, but I don't know. The October 22nd, 1844. And my favorite thing about this is they even show like little drawings and representations of the safes that they made. So they all made little safes and bunkers, and you even see like their crackers and things that they have saved up, and they're waiting for Jesus to come, and they're waiting. And October 22nd came and went, and Jesus did not come. And he's like, no. I made a mistake. It's 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
So again, it's the same thing happened, and Jesus did not come. And then, of course, this is the beginning of Adventism, and this kind of disappeared here in Canada, and it moved to the States. But the Great Disappointment, I think that's fantastic.
and the rapture was an invention primarily of John Nelson Darby between 1827 and around 1833 over in the UK. And it came to the U.S., and non-U.S. Christianity grew out of it very quickly, and U.S. Christianity was like, no,
you say it, not me. So I'll let you say it.
Yeah, they threw a temper tantrum basically and said, no, the rapture is rhetorically useful. We like scaring the crap out of our kids and traumatizing them, so we're gonna keep this idea that one day everybody's just going to be yanked up into the sky, and all the wicked people will be left to suffer. And yeah, it's a ridiculous revenge fantasy.
And so does this come from the prophecy of Daniel or Daniel?
Daniel is a part of it. The idea of one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, but the primary text is 1 Thessalonians 4:17, which is where it talks about how those who are alive will be snatched up to meet Jesus coming in the clouds, and then they will be with Jesus forever. But the imagery, most scholars agree today, that imagery is pretty stereotypical of a conqueror or a sovereign returning victorious to their kingdom, and everybody coming outside of the city gates to go out and meet them and then usher them back into their kingdom. And so the idea is to just reorient that vertically, so that you're going up into the sky to meet Jesus, and then everybody turns back around and comes back down, and Jesus enters into his kingdom on earth. And so most scholars would say Darby misunderstood that.
So what you're saying is, in order to have flying powers, we need to die first. That's what's going on. That's a part of it. Yeah. That's a horrible way to become an X-Man. I'm sorry. I'm not doing that. But
my understanding is that there are not fun ways to become an X-Man, but yeah, that would be one of the bad ones.
I honestly, I prefer the radioactive spider at that point. Just give it to me rather than oh yes, you have to die and hope that you come back as a cool super X-Men. Okay, so when did El become Adonai and Yahweh? What happened to Asherah, which I know you just did a video on, Kadosh, Shemesh, Mayim, and all the other gods mentioned in the Bible as well? Ooh. Is it Yahweh or Yehovah?
Well, it's not Yehovah. That I think pretty much everybody agrees that's the product of a medieval conflation, because the main substitution anciently for the divine name was the vowels of Adonai, which if you superimpose them on the consonants, and then you go fast forward to the medieval period and you transliterate it into Latin, you get something like Yehovah, which then becomes Jehovah once the J earns its place. But I think the scholarly consensus is that the original patron deity of Israel was Israel, And
Mm-hmm.
that was the El of the broader Northwest Semitic pantheon, the patriarchal and benevolent high deity who is aged and wise and sits on their throne, dispensing justice. And then the theory is that somewhere in the 11th or 10th century BCE, the Shasu, probably a band of nomadic peoples from the other side of the Jordan River, perhaps deeper into the Arabian Peninsula, comes into the northern hill country with their deity, who is named Adonai Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. We have 14th and 13th century Egyptian inscriptions that refer to the land of Yod-Heh-Vav Aleph in Egyptian that is associated with the Shasu. So they probably named their deity after their land, and they come in and bring that deity into Israel. And my opinion is that they probably initially said, let's make Adonai the storm deity. But there was already a storm deity named Baal. And so there was conflict between Adonai and Baal. And you have the famous story of the competition between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, where at the end, all the people proclaim Adonai, Hu-Ha Elohim, Hu-Ha Elohim. In other words, he is the storm deity for this region. And so I think that Adonai came into the pantheon on the second tier as one of the Bnei Elohim, not as El, but then later, I think a devotee of Adonai rose to the throne, or a king decided, hey, I like the cut of that deity's jib, and conflated the two and began a campaign of conflation that probably lasted for a few centuries, that was intended to try to consolidate power by bringing all the adherents of these different deities together. And then they probably along the way appropriated Shaddai and Shemesh and Sedek and all these other deities as well. So it was a long-term policy of conflation and subsuming the other deities and their divine powers. And I've said before, I think there are two of the most significant, most powerful, most important advertising campaigns in the history of humanity were probably, one, whoever had the idea to conflate Adonai and El, and two, Josiah's cult centralization in the late 7th century BCE. I think those two things probably are mainly responsible for the later development of monotheism and the three monotheistic faiths that we have today.
Okay, so we're almost out of time, but we have a couple questions left. So let's try to do a lightning round.
Okay.
One, why do people think Ophanaim are angels? Who said they were biblically accurate angels?
Not me. And not the Bible, because Ophanim are nowhere mentioned as the angels. I think it has to do with the fact that all the divine beings that are not God are kind of shoved into the angelic grab bag in post-biblical Christianity, and I don't know about Judaism. I don't know what the angelology of late antique or medieval or modern Judaism is, but I think it was just a tradition that said if it's not God, then it's got to be an angel, and so they just superimpose that interpretive lens on the Bible and say, Ophanim, not God, that's an angel.
Especially, I mean, there's the cherubim, there's the Nephilim, there's all these different that they ended
Seraphim, there are all these, and none of them are referred to as angels anywhere in the Bible.
No, they're not. Next question: why do scholars think Jesus spoke Aramaic and not Hebrew? Mishnaic Hebrew and Middle Aramaic were around the same time.
The text suggests that when the gospel authors are reporting on Jesus's dialogue, when they do transliterate, they say, "Oh, this is from Aramaic," or they'll provide it transliterated into Greek, and it's very clearly Aramaic. So I think that is the main impetus for that, and also it's a tradition that has existed since the earliest Christians, and I think just because Aramaic was the main lingua franca, there's disagreement about whether or not Jesus just grew up poor and just was went to work in his father's industry, or if he actually had the privilege of an education in the text. I happen to think it was probably the former, that he probably did not grow up with a formal education in Torah, but was just kind of self-taught and autodidact. And so
Thanks, Dad.
and so I think that Aramaic makes more sense.
Is your eye trying to kill you?
There's an eyelash that is
No.
loose and is hanging right in my vision. I'm trying to get...
Oh no.
Okay.
Good? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Next question. What was the first mention of Jesus? Was his real name Yeshua? Was Thomas his secret twin, or was it James? Was the Gospel of James Jesus, or Gospel of Thomas just Jesus fanfic?
I think the Gospel of Thomas is probably mainly Jesus fanfic, but there is a possibility, there is a plausibility that some of the sayings there pre-existed the canonical Gospels. I don't think Thomas was a twin of Jesus. That is a 2nd century CE tradition. James almost certainly was the actual biological brother of Jesus. And I think that was all. First mention of Jesus, Paul would be the first mention of Jesus. However, the name Jesus, or at least Jesus in the Greek, is found in the Septuagint, because there are the name Yeshua occurs in a couple places in the Aramaic portions of the Hebrew Bible, and when that was translated into Greek, it's transliterated as Jesus. So Jesus's name is not original. That is a transliteration into Greek that existed for more than a century before Jesus was born.
So Jesus is more biblically accurate. Next question. What are the Watchers watching, and who are the Watchers?
The Watchers are watching over humanity. They're supposed to be ensuring that everything's going cool with them, but the Watchers then decide that they are going to descend and cause trouble. And
next question. Sorry.
I was going to say there is a I think that's the main stuff.
Okay. So next question. Dead Sea Scrolls. How did they change our understanding of the Bible?
They showed that there was a lot of textual instability because you have multiple manuscripts of single texts, and they don't match identically. It shows that there were people who were transmitting and storing these scrolls who were perfectly happy to have different versions of Genesis and Exodus that didn't say the exact same thing. It also helps us to reconstruct more of the textual past of the Hebrew Bible and how the texts were related to each other. And they're also just really, really cool. Mm-hmm. And if you ever get a chance to go to Qumran, you should definitely go. It's a fascinating little place. Not a large place, but a fascinating little place.
Though some of the best places are often old and small. Yeah. Next question. What is the Key of Solomon where the 72 demons gathered from the Shem HaMephorash? And is there anything from this text that comes from the Kabbalah?
I don't know much about the background of the Key of Solomon, but I know that's probably a late antique literary innovation, and I'm sure that there's some kind of points of contact between that and Kabbalah, but I'm not a specialist in that time period, so I wouldn't be able to.
Oh, really, Dad? You want to talk about how the fact that some of the books are probably forged? Do you want to talk about how Shimon Bar Yochai probably did not write most of it? Would you?
Oh, well, I was pretty sure that whoever was attributed as the author was not the author, but I'm not a specialist there, so I'll leave that one to you.
No, I'm not letting them come after me. Well, there are many different books that are considered to be part of the Kabbalah, and obviously it's been spiced up for flavor for modern audiences. But in ancient days, not everybody could read it. But there's the Sefer Yetzirah, there's the Zohar. The Zohar is probably the most controversial one because for a long time it was attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived a very long time ago. And now, however, it's a lot of scholars do believe that it was really De Leon, possibly my ancestor, who. Cool. We hope. I mean, the name is there. I have the same last name. But I'll say that he's my ancestor. Next question: who invented gematria and why? Why do people keep using this as a system to claim that the Bible foretells current events?
Well, you really don't see the use of Hebrew characters used for their numerical value until shortly after around 200 BCE. And it's probably around 80 BCE that you first see gematria popping up. So I don't know who it was, but it's pretty late in the history of Hebrew. And a lot of people will say, oh, the Bible has, the Bible is written in this code because all the letters can be numbers. Like, Daniel was the only book that was written in a period when they used the individual Hebrew letters as numbers. Prior to that, they either borrowed hieratic numbers from Egyptian, or they wrote out the numbers. And so that is a pretty late innovation, and then gematria, an even later innovation. But yeah, and there are not a lot of good cases for gematria apart from the mark of the beast and Revelation is probably gematria. And some people think that in the Gospel of John, when they pull 153 fish out, when they throw their nets in, that's probably gematria that's associated with a passage, I think in Ezekiel, but I don't remember exactly what it has to do with anything.
Oh God, I hear this all the time where people saying that they take passages and they go, oh, you see this passage. Well, if you add this and plus that, and then you times it by this, it means that this was the 6 million people who died. You just go, no, you need to stop. Because you could literally do that with anything. We had this talk and we talked about ley lines and how it's arbitrary. You can literally make up anything and say, yes, this is it. And somebody will believe it. Anyway.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's been a thing. Last question. How did Lilith become associated as Adam's wife? Is this a cultural memory from Lilitu? How is she linked with the Garden of Eden when her name is not there?
So you have within early Judaism this interpretive tradition that tries to harmonize the two different creation accounts at the beginning of the book of Genesis by suggesting that there were two creations, that man and woman were created simultaneously, and then later on Adam was created, and then after Adam, Eve was created. And that led to the speculation that, well, if there are two different creations, then there was a woman before Eve. And so by the time you get to between the 7th and the 10th century CE, you have a tradition developing where they identify Lilith as that woman who existed before Eve. And so you have a text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, which has in, I believe it's chapter 70 or 72, I forget which one, but has Lilith saying that she wants to be on top, which is exactly what it sounds like. And Adam says, you are not fit to be on top. I am the only one who is fit to be on top, and I am not fit to be beneath. And Lilith says, I'm out. And says that, no, we are equal. And she storms out of the Garden of Eden and takes off. And then God is like, damn it. Okay, you 3 angels, go bring her back. And so he sends 3 angels named Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangaloth. And they go catch up with Lilith. And they're like, hey, you got to come back to the Garden of Eden. And she says, nope, not coming back. I am going to go torment men with my deviant sexuality. And then I'm also going to afflict newborn babies with illness and with death, unless they're wearing an amulet with your 3 names on it. And so this is likely an etiology for the practice of giving newborns amulets, apotropaic amulets meant to ward off evil. And some of them evidently had the names of angels, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangaloth on them. And so that's something that comes up almost 1,000 years after.
I think this is partly also a cultural memory from Babylonian times, where you have Lilitu and Pazuzu, because Lilitu does exactly
the bird and
exactly. So they have exactly the same dynamic, where if you put Pazuzu in the window, he wards off evil for this. So he stops babies dying essentially, or being taken.
Yeah. And then the only time Lilith pops up in the Hebrew Bible is in Book of Isaiah, where it seems to be a reference to some kind of malevolent divine figure that occupies the uninhabitable wilderness. And in Mesopotamia, the Lilith was associated with some kind of deviant feminine sexuality and some kind of demonic figure. But
and we do see we see her image as well, put on Mesopotamian bowls, and she is I mean, the images are hilarious. They're so adorable. Where they have like little chibi Lilith going, yeah,
Yeah,
and they're
yeah.
she's in the middle, and you took that she does. She has little fangs and things. It's adorable. But you take, the bowl and you put it under your house, and the idea was that you would trap her spirit so she
Hmm,
wouldn't come and haunt the rest of you. So
yeah.
we came to the end of the questions. I would love to ask you tons more, but you've been so generous with your time already. So we'll leave that for another time. Dan, thank you so much for being here. This was such a joy. I really love this. This is amazing.